Welcome to Siliconsciousness, the DSR Network podcast focusing on the artificial intelligence revolution, politics, and policy.
This podcast is underwritten in part by the U.S. Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Its editorial content is completely independent, and the views expressed are exclusively those of participating experts. It is presented live, without editing. For further information about the UAE's efforts in the areas of artificial intelligence and technology, go to the website of the embassy at www.uae-embassy.org and search for UAE-US Tech Cooperation. We thank them for their support. We thank everybody who's supporting this podcast for their support, and we look forward to it developing and growing over time because the issue is so important. Hello and welcome to Siliconsciousness. I'm David Rothkopf, your host, and this week, as every week, we're going to talk a little bit about AI. This week with a focus on AI and policy, industrial policy, specifically here in the United States. See what we're doing to seize the moment with regard to this new age. We're lucky to have with us Doug Calidas. He is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for Americans for Responsible Innovation and an expert on emerging technologies and AI policies. Last month, Doug authored a report for Harvard's Belfer Center exploring the outlook for U.S. industrial policy during the second half of this administration. Doug has previously served in the Senate as most recently as Chief of Staff to Senator Amy Klobuchar. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you, David. Great to be here.
So let's start right where this report seems to deal with things. We're at the beginning of a transformative moment. And certainly the administration seems to be doing lots and lots of things that have some impact on AI policy. But let's take a step back. Would you call what they're doing a coordinated industrial policy?
The administration has a lot of different objectives. Some of them could be described as industrial policy. Some of them could not. We can start with what's probably on everyone's mind, which is the tariffs. And it's been spoken of that many that there are three reasons why you institute tariffs, and we're seeing them at play here. I mean, you do it because you're trying to protect your own industry and possibly return jobs to the United States. You do it to raise tax revenue, and you do it because you want to have some impact on the international order. Now, what happened over the last couple of weeks and is going forward has implications for all three of them.
Which of those are we doing?
I think what the president is trying to do is primarily trying to reindustrialize America. Whether or not that'll be successful is a question that's going to take a long time to figure out. But of course, even if that is someone's goal, it has major implications on geopolitics, on economic policy, and any number of other policies that are related to this. So there's a lot of different dynamics, and it's hard to just pull one out and say, this is what he's trying to do.
Right. In other podcasts, we've talked about the inflationary consequences, the foreign relations consequences, the consequences for the dollar. But let's just talk about the consequences for this idea of reindustrialization. The president today, we're recording this on a Monday, the president today has said, well, I've got some new tariffs coming on semiconductors. And he also said, he made a comment right before this meeting with Bukele about NVIDIA, which I was surprised at the specificity of the comment, but he was like, yeah, NVIDIA, that's really important and we really need them. And they're investing a bunch of money here, which is about sort of a little more, about 40% more than they said they were going to invest under the Chips and Science Act here in the United States. And then he made this kind of interesting comment about that sort of indicated he understands the import of all of this because he said, they kind of run the world now, don't they? So I was wondering what your thoughts were on all that.
Sure. So semiconductors and NVIDIA semiconductors, which are manufactured by TSMC, are the white hot center of industrial strategy. There's a reason why when we saw all the supply chain issues during the COVID pandemic and the Biden administration came in, what they focused on all things that were raised by the supply chain concerns was chips, right? Because that's what we saw. We didn't have access to the latest chips and even the legacy chips that were used in things like automotive manufacturing. It really impacted a large number of industries. And that was a wake-up call to, I think, both parties who realized that no matter what your priors are on the wisdom of industrial policy, if the market is pushing production of cutting-edge semiconductors outside of the United States and the U.S. has an increasingly small percentage of manufacturing share in leading edge semiconductors, this could lead to some bad outcomes. And, there's a lot of talk when the CHIPS Act was passed about, military vulnerabilities, ways in which China or other nations could squeeze the United States. I don't think there's been any concern that Taiwan, where TSMC manufactures the bulk of its chips, is not an ally of the U.S. But of course, they're right next to China. They're vulnerable to a blockade. That's something that people have been worried about for many years. So Trump recognizes all of this. And you referenced my paper. We look into some of the dynamics that could lead him to resurrect something like the CHIPS Act later in his term, if there were a need be for him to want to find a broader political coalition. But I think he's cognizant of the way in which the manufacturing of leading edge chips, particularly NVIDIA chips, is significant for U.S. leadership and technology, for all the things that he wants to do in terms of promoting U.S. growth. It's a very, very tricky issue. And I think he's recognizing that, even though he's acting pretty aggressively.
Yeah, aggressively is right. I think he's also acting a little erratically, because one moment it's we're going to put on these tariffs, another moment they're non-negotiable, another moment they're a negotiating tool, another moment they're on hold for a few days, then some of them are on hold, then not all of them are on hold, and so forth. And that makes the world a little uneasy. And the reason I bring this up is because if you're going to invest a substantial amount of money in the United States to build a chip fab or to do anything, you want to feel confident that the money is safe, that it's a good market, that it's a platform to reach the people you need to reach. And there aren't better platforms out there. And that's kind of a longer term perspective. Do you deal with those issues in the paper, and what's your outlook?
We do. I think our conclusion is that the Chips and Science Act, which was passed in 2022, and it's important to remember that the precursor of this, which authorized the CHIPS program, was actually passed in the tail end of the first Trump administration. His Undersecretary of State, Keith Crack, actually negotiated it with a few prominent senators on the Hill, Senators Corner and Mark Warner. And they passed this before Trump left office. They didn't get the funding for it. And the funding came 2 years later in the Chips and Science Act. But the idea that President Trump's interest in reshoring domestic chip manufacturing was the earthquake that kind of launched all this. So in the paper, we talk about how all the political incentives are in place for President Trump to support the CHIPS Act and efforts like this. If you've been following President Trump's actions over the last 10 years, then you know that a lot of it is based on my predecessor did X, so I'm going to do Y, and I'm going to say that X was terrible. There's really no reason for him to, throw shade at the CHIPS Act, except for the fact that it was passed on President Biden's watch. There's really nothing else about it that should be counter to what he wants to do. I think the only other factor there is that people have joked that you can conduct international policy and trade policy by carrots and by sticks. And President Trump seems only interested in sticks. Anything that looks like a carrot, which will accomplish his objectives, but is, using funding rather than threats, he doesn't want to do. Our contention in the paper is that if you look at the last couple years of his current term, particularly if Democrats retake the House, all the political incentives are there for him to simply say, I'm going to do a subsidies program. I want to make sure that people invest in chip manufacturing or other advanced industry in the US. I can easily get Democratic support for this. It's popular with my base. It's popular with swing voters. There's no reason for him not to do it if he's willing to simply part with what he's saying right now and accept that maybe something that President Biden did was actually a good thing.
Yeah, well, so two interesting points with that. One, we live at a particularly volatile moment politically in which Trump and the Republicans and Democratic leaders, whoever they may be, and Democrats are at each other's throat on almost everything. And without prejudice to any views on anything else, it does seem like there is actually a hint of continuity in U.S. foreign policy, U.S. economic policy around this issue. There is a hint of awareness that too much exposure to Taiwan as a manufacturing center is not a good thing, that the future depends on the ability to not only manufacture chips, but to do so in a way that is reliable, that provides us with a dependable source, is something both administrations have, or all three, if you want to, Trump 1, Biden, Trump 2, all seem to be somewhat committed to. And the second part of that is, as to the issue of subsidies, the Trump administration has reached out to foreign governments and domestic manufacturers alike and said, if you invest a substantial amount of money, we're going to grease the skids for you on approvals, on other kinds of things. So if not exactly subsidies, they are trying some carrots with regard to getting big chunks of foreign investment here. And frankly, the political stakes for him to show more foreign investment here are much higher now that he's done the tariffs with that as a stated purpose. So I was wondering if you'd comment on both those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. I think that my comment about carrots and sticks was a little oversimplified. He definitely has, even during his most recent campaign, he's talked about the things that they're going to try to do to bring back domestic manufacturing. He's talked about tax subsidies, energy awards, ways of trying to help with labor costs, all kinds of different things that economists would recognize as subsidies. It's funny in that he's gone out of his way to specifically disavow any interest in the types of cash grants that formed the basis of the CHIPS and Science Act. Again, because I think he simply wants to cast that as something that his predecessor did that he doesn't agree with. We think even that element will prove irresistible to him later in his term, and he'll be willing to do a cash subsidies program. But that's correct.
But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it will prove irresistible to him later in his term, I would project that to mean after he's gotten all the tax cuts approved. Because right now he's in the let's cut spending because we want to partially justify this. But once all that's through, he will be as tempted as anybody else, I think, on the subsidies front. If I'm putting words in your mouth, then tell me I'm, wrong.
No, I think that's right. I think, legislatively, he and the Republicans are so focused on the reconciliation bill right now, and they'll have another bite at the apple next year if they do another bill. And, by definition, these reconciliation bills are partisan exercises. So he's going to have to do something that appeals directly to Republicans in both chambers, and given the margins in the House, they can only lose a few votes. So this is going to be all focused on tax and then somewhat on energy and issues around that way. Our contention is that after the first 2 years, particularly if the House flips and Democrats retake a majority, then a bipartisan subsidies effort for advanced manufacturing could prove very, very attractive to the president.
Yeah. So, if, we're trying to create, first of all, it's kind of interesting. I was in the Commerce Department in the Clinton administration. And if we had gone into a meeting and said, hey, let's have an industrial policy, we would have been asked to leave the meeting. That was, forbidden territory, right? But now people are like, and Biden just sort of went out and owned it, and in his own way, without those words. Trump seems to be doing it too. Um, uh, if we were to have an industrial policy, one issue might have to do with trade policy. One issue might have to do with subsidies. But another one in the area of AI has to do with the provision of sufficient amounts of power to enable you to run a lot of power thirsty data centers. And I'm wondering how that figures in the equation.
Absolutely. And I think you've seen on some of the President Trump's executive orders already, when he talks about AI, he talks about power. There was a hearing recently in the House, in the Energy and Commerce Committee last week, where all the members on both sides of the aisle and all the witnesses were just talking about the power and energy requirements of AI and how they're only going to grow significantly in future years. I think this is something that pretty much all the Republicans agree on. I think among Democrats, there's a recognition that this is true, but of course, there's strong commitment to climate objectives, and this gets dicey. But I do believe that there's a recognition that power is going to become a national security imperative. There's a lot of talk of extending some of the things that President Biden did before he left office to try to fast track permitting and construction of data centers. I think the president's going to do everything he can on that front by executive order. And there's been a lot of talk in Congress in recent years of a bipartisan permitting reform bill. I think that's going to get another hard look. That's a tricky one to get done. Again, there's a lot of concern among groups that have traditionally been wary of environmental damage and climate impact. Again, the climate impact cuts both ways, because if you want new clean energy projects to get off the ground, you need to build them quickly. But this is an issue that's only gaining in saliency. We heard about it a little bit a couple years ago, more last year, and now it's one of the only things I hear about when I go around the Hill.
Yeah, in doing this show, which we've been doing for a long time now, we hear about it more than any other single issue. And of course, there are policy choices with regard to producing power. And, the president last week said, well, we're going to double down on coal. You can't imagine a Democratic president would do that. But we're the world's leading producer of energy. We have a lot of options in that regard. The question I think becomes, do you think the U.S. is doing enough in this area or other areas to maintain the edge it has had in AI policy and in AI development? Or do you think it's just a natural thing that as this revolution progresses, other places catch up with us?
That's a big question. And you talked before about, during your times working in a Democratic administration, even the term industrial policy was kind of off the table. There were a lot of good speeches given by, Biden administration officials last term. I think Jake Sullivan gave a speech at Georgetown. Catherine Tai gave a speech where they really laid out the history of international economic policy and the ways in which, it really was incumbent upon the U.S. to have a vision for an industrial policy and a more muscular role for government in promoting the outcomes that we think we need to see in order to maintain our leadership as a nation. Of course, that was even more an article of faith among Republicans, and Trump sort of single-handedly broke them out of that mold. But if we recognize that, leaving things to the whims of the free market isn't necessarily going to produce the outcome we want as a citizenry, it may lead to efficiency globally, but it may not be great for the United States. The question then becomes, what do we do about it? You'll often hear people talk about what China is doing, as a, still a semi-planned economy. They can muster huge amounts of capital. They can start these huge venture funds. They can flood the world with cheap products. They can just command things in a way that the U.S. can't. We're not going to out-China China. That's something that you'll hear a lot, but it does require revisiting some of the things that we thought were settled over the last few decades. I do think there is a major role for government in recognizing what the private sector can and cannot do and where help is needed. If you look at investment in AI research, there's still more investment in development and extending research capabilities in frontier models in the United States than anywhere in the world, right? We have the best capital markets. We attract capital. There's a return on investment. I think that's doing just fine. But there are things that the market left to its own devices is going to underinvest in. So, one of those things we believe is AI safety, AI security, trying to make sure that actually the way that these models are developed is in a way that people trust, it's reliable, that has standards, that we can sustain it long term. I believe there's a role for government there. I think when it comes to energy policy, because so much of that is regulated already, there is likely a role for revisiting the regulatory apparatus, making sure that the checks we have in place are accomplishing the policy that we want to accomplish. I would not agree with Republicans who say just cut all the regulations and that'll get government out of the way. I don't think that's the answer. But I do believe we have to revisit some of the decisions that were made in the 1970s, 1980s, and made sense for the world then, but things have changed a lot.
Yeah, no doubt. And as you talk, three things cross my mind. I'll see if I can remember them all and get to them all in the time that we've got remaining. But just as a comment, it's striking to me as somebody who's been in this world of both international economic policy and foreign policy and tech policy for 30 years, that 30 years ago, the center of gravity in both parties was towards free trade. And today, the center of gravity in neither party is towards free trade. And I think to some extent that's because it didn't work to different degrees. There were strategic vulnerabilities revealed. There were dislocations in labor forces that resulted in this to some degree. But when you talk about creating the right conditions, let me see if I can get to the additional things that I wanted to. One is a stable regulatory environment, and maybe come to that at the end, because Trump is surrounded by a lot of AI types who are sort of saying, hey, why don't you leave this to us? And the question is whether there's too much of that or the right amount. But even before that, the other thing, just as you want, like you talk about American capital markets, another thing the U.S. has always been able to say is we attract the best minds. People come here to graduate education in the United States. So you want to locate here because we're the magnet for that. Clearly, something's going on there. And a lot of our recent immigration policies seem to have people around the world going, I don't know. And that could have a competitive effect here. But quite, again, the merits of the policy aside, if you don't attract the best brains, you're not going to win this. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are on either of those points.
Sure. I think everyone's pointed out that the MAGA coalition is a coalition, and there are seams within the coalition. We saw this flare up right at the beginning of the administration when there was discussion about the H-1B policy and some personnel at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And there was an online dust-up, I believe, between Laura Loomer and Elon Musk. And you saw some of the people who were in the Elon Musk camp who were really the technologists saying, we need to welcome the best and the brightest from all around the world. That's the only way that we can maintain our technological lead on AI, which is in line with what you've been saying, which I believe a lot of people in both parties believe. Laura Loomer, who had Steve Bannon on her side, was saying, listen, Trump was elected not with the votes of people who want to expand immigration, expand H-1B visas. He was voted by people in the heartland who want jobs for people who were born in this country, were raised in this country. It's a cultural split. I agree with you. I think that if the goal is maintaining U.S. leadership in AI, it's a no-brainer to want to have the best and the brightest from around the world. But Trump's coalition is not simply made up of people who are primarily focused on tech policy. They're cultural priorities from people who have a lot of sway within his coalition that pull the other way. And that's going to be fought out over the next 4 years. And I don't know who's going to win.
Yeah, it's a little tough for me, as a Dem, to say, oh yeah, Elon's right. But, he's kind of been right on the trade thing, and he's kind of right on this thing. The question is Elon and Peter Thiel and Mark Andreessen and that whole crowd putting too much pressure on Trump to leave the driving to us, to leave the regulating aside here. We'll take care of it. Everything will be just fine. Is there too much of that?
Yeah, there could be, and not to overcomplicate things, but it's interesting to see splits even in that coalition. We talked as an organization at Americans for Responsible Innovation about how Elon Musk has actually been raising the alarm about some risks in advanced AI systems for years. He talked even before he was involved in helping to found OpenAI. He was concerned that AI research was advancing so quickly that we would lose the ability to regulate it or really even understand what's going on in the systems. And it could lead to some pretty bad outcomes that a more thoughtful society would want to get ahead of. That view is not shared by many others in Silicon Valley. You mentioned Mark Andreessen. I mean, Mark Andreessen is probably the best known proponent of what they call accelerationism, which is just get government out of the way and let everything just go full speed ahead. And then within the sort of MAGA Heartland coalition, Steve Bannon, Tucker Carlson, they voiced major concerns about AI risks and a concern that could develop more quickly than we're able to put guardrails on it. And again, lead to some pretty dangerous outcomes. There's a lot of very interesting seams within Trump world that are not always visible to those looking from the outside. It has its own complications on AI policy in the same way that Democrats do. And some of these coalitions line up across parties in ways that are odd.
Yeah. I'm just to tell you in advance, I want to invite you back because I want to talk about that because, I see that a lot too. And, it's complicated also by the fact that the number of people on the, in the place you formerly worked on the Hill who actually understand the ins and outs of this is pretty small. And so they become a little bit malleable to, confident outside voices. And that's a little dangerous. But we'll get to that, at some point in the not too distant future, I hope. Let me ask you one last question that has to do with the industrial policy question. One of China's responses to the tariffs is, okay, fine, you do that. We're going to raise tariffs. And by the way, the rare earth metals you need? You're not going to get those. Now, it's interesting because Trump's a little zeroed in on rare earth metals. I don't know that he knows. I don't know if you sat next to him and said, name me a rare earth metal. I'm not sure he could do that. But I think he has gleaned enough from his advisors that these are essential to this competitiveness, that it has led him to some of his most notable and in some respects kind of out there policies, like let's go get Greenland. We need Greenland because we need the rare earth metals. Quite apart from the fact that Greenland may or may not actually have the rare earth metals. That's not a proven fact. It does raise the stakes around that issue. And I'm just wondering how you guys sort of saw that evolving.
Sure. I think when you're trying to understand what China's strategy is, there's a couple of things to keep in mind. One is that as an autocrat, President Xi can do things that President Trump can't necessarily do because he doesn't really necessarily need to maintain the same level of public support as a U.S. president does. So they do think in terms of a long game. They can be willing to wait out short-term pain. They're willing to really pay the price in the short term if they believe is the right long-term strategy. And that is something that, of course, none of us want to live in an autocracy, but if you're in a negotiation, having that kind of weight behind you and that patience is clearly a value that she brings. But I do think that the move in restricting the export of rare earths is going to backfire on China. It's a power move that they're playing early to show that they have leverage over the United States. And it's effective in that it really puts President Trump and his negotiators in a difficult position. But at the same time, for their domestic purposes, it shows exactly what they're trying to prove. They're trying to say, listen, If we get in the point where we have an incident with China, maybe China decides to retake Taiwan, or they do things in the South China Sea that are really not okay with the U.S. allies, then China can simply threaten to cut off exports of rare earth minerals, or they could cut off active pharmaceutical ingredients and things that the American people simply rely on for our way of life. It's not a good position to be in. And if they're already doing that now, it in some ways proves that point. And I think one telling example of this is going back to, I think it was about 15 years or so. I might have my year wrong, but they did the same thing with Japan when there was a dispute over some islands between China and Japan. And it was really a wake-up call to Japan. And Japan had a similar percentage of rare earths that were processed in China as the United States does now. And since in the intervening 15 years, they've gotten that way down because they've realized we don't ever want to be in this position again. We're just too vulnerable. And I think since China has already played that card, that will be something that's not quickly forgotten by U.S. policymakers because it shows how much leverage they have.
Yeah, well, as a foreign policy guy, I look at it and I go, on the one hand, I don't know that I would be like super comforted if I were Taiwan, that both the Democrats and the Republicans who can't agree on anything can agree on one thing, which is we shouldn't be more dependent on Taiwan, because that doesn't bode super well for the future, right? The other thing is that I can just imagine Trump going, China made me take over Greenland. That they're sort of being presented with this, look, they're squeezing us. What are we going to do? This is the world we live in today. But look, we'll see how that goes. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I really appreciate the insights that you offer. Is the study you did at Belfer available online for just ordinary folks to read?
It is. It's at the Belfer Center website, belfercenter.org. It should pop up if you put my name in.
So you should definitely do that, and hopefully we'll get you to pop up back here again. Because I'd love to continue the conversation. But this was great. Thank you very much. And thank everybody for listening. We're here, of course, every single week with Still Consciousness and also with our other AI-related podcast on energy and climate, which is continuing onward. It's become now a regular podcast because of your support of it. So we're grateful for that. Join us for those things and everything else we do here at the DSR Network. And we'll see you at one of those places sometime soon. Bye-bye.